Okay, so I know that a lot has happened over the weekend and a lot happened in the days leading up to the weekend as well. A lot has happened, okay?
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. Walk us through just the chronology of the past week and then where we sit today with these dynamics.
Yeah. So essentially, we've had a few weeks of escalating negotiations between Anthropic and the Pentagon over essentially what Anthropic will allow the Pentagon to use its AI for. So the Pentagon wants to be able to use AI companies' AI for, quote, all lawful uses. And Anthropic has two red lines: no use of its AI for mass domestic surveillance, and no use of its AI for fully autonomous weapon systems. So, what happened last week after these weeks of negotiations that have spilled out into the public, Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei and Pete Hegseth meet face to face, continuing negotiations. Anthropic, days after this, publishes a statement essentially saying that it's going to hold to these red lines. That on Friday, they have a deadline to essentially either agree to the Anthrop. On Friday,
There,
they have
it's
sorry.
been a long weekend. I thought I know you've been working the phones all weekend. So
Yes.
let me help you with this timeline.
Yeah.
So Friday they have the deadline.
Yes.
5:01 p.m. is when the Department of Defense and Anthropic have to reach a deal. Anthropic has to say whether or not they will budge on these red lines essentially. And then where we sort of left off last week is OpenAI came into the mix. How did they come into the mix?
Yeah, so OpenAI has been negotiating this deal essentially as in parallel as Anthropic has been negotiating its deal. And so at 5:01 p.m. ET, the deal does not come together for Anthropic, and Pete Hegseth declares Anthropic a supply chain risk. Later that night, OpenAI announces that it's signed a similar but different and many important aspects deal with the Pentagon to provide OpenAI's models on classified systems.
Okay, so we have the OpenAI agreement, and now we have the Anthropic supply chain risk designation. I want to get into both of these pieces separately. Eh, Was OpenAI's agreement with the Pentagon any different than
Yeah.
what Anthropic was sort of fighting against?
Yeah. Yeah. So, in many important ways, yes. Anthropic was fighting against this contractual language that said that the Pentagon could use its AI for any lawful uses. OpenAI agreed to this contract language. However, OpenAI says that it negotiated other bits of the agreement that it's hoping will help it keep the exact same red lines as Anthropic, which is prohibitions against the use of its AI for lethal autonomous weapons and mass surveillance. So, OpenAI says that because it can keep its safety guardrails in its models, it can use technological means to prevent the Pentagon from doing those things. OpenAI also negotiated its agreement so that it only works in the cloud, not on edge deployed models, which OpenAI says means that it can't be used on lethal autonomous weapons. And finally, OpenAI negotiated the right to have OpenAI engineers, cleared personnel working with the Pentagon to help implement it, which they're hoping will give them more visibility into what's actually going on.
So in other words, OpenAI is saying that, hey, what we may have given up a little bit in terms of language, we actually have those extra guardrails in place on the technology side. And so
It's
we can ensure that we have a little bit of control over what the
yeah.
technology is being used for.
And just to note, like we've seen part of the contract, which in fairness is more than we've seen from Anthropic. So OpenAI released a couple paragraphs of contract language over the weekend that deal specifically with the lethal autonomous weapons and mass domestic surveillance clauses. So we've seen two paragraphs of the contract, but we haven't seen the whole thing. And so we don't know how it works with safety guardrails or for deployed engineers or whatever. And so there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
Okay, now how have people been reacting to this? Because over the weekend, I mean, I've seen people posting screenshots of Anthropic climbing up the leaderboard. I've seen people with very strong reactions both ways
Yeah.
to OpenAI's contract. Just walk us through how people are thinking about these two.
Right. So it's been a huge weekend for sitting on Twitter and watching people post about it. Um, Over the weekend, like Sam Altman and some of his top execs did like an Ask Me Anything on Twitter. So huge weekend for people posting. I mean, overall, there's a moment. when the deal was first announced, there was a moment when people were like, "Oh my god, like how did OpenAI get the exact same deal that Anthropic failed to get?" But over the weekend, that sentiment really swung towards OpenAI seems to have accepted something that Anthropic had concerns about. And so that raises a lot of questions about, for example, how OpenAI employees feel about this. As of last night, around 100 of them had signed this pledge, co-organized with Google around standing in solidarity with Anthropic. And so OpenAI employees, especially researchers, are in this incredibly hot talent market. We all remember like the AI talent wars from last summer. And so if OpenAI employees decide to kind of try to speak out against this, there could be some real impact there. On the other hand, we don't totally know like how this contract works. And OpenAI has said that it kept the same red lines as Anthropic, and so it's possible that OpenAI employees are like happy with this contract.
Now, what about the Anthropic lawsuit? I know that I think, as far as we know, Anthropic has released a statement. They said we plan to challenge this designation
Yeah.
in court.
Yep.
So we don't know a lot, but I
Right.
wonder if you've talked to any lawyers or any experts around what sort of legal argument they might use and how much of a chance you think they have to
Yeah.
overturn this designation.
Right. So essentially, what Pete Hegseth has done is declare Anthropic a supply chain risk. And in his tweet on Friday, he used a really expansive definition of supply chain risk. And so what he wrote was that he was barring Anthropic from having any commercial relationship with anyone who does business with the Pentagon, which is so many companies. For example, Anthropic's cloud providers, Amazon and Google, are both military contractors. And so theoretically, this could cut Anthropic off from not even just being able to sell to customers, but being able to like receive cloud services. And so this is a really big deal if courts uphold it, as Pete Hegseth has talked about. But I think the question is, would courts uphold it? My colleague Rocket talked to some lawyers on Friday. This idea is that this is a law that was designed for foreign companies. Like it's not designed to be applied to an American company. So there's that. Dario, the CEO of Anthropic, is also arguing that it would only ban Anthropic from being used much more narrowly in the military supply chain. So there's that argument secondarily. However, there's also the point that courts may be more likely to defer to the federal government on matters of national security. That was also a point that came up in the TikTok ban, if you remember that. Um, and for in practicality, like companies who are dealing with Anthropic may just find it easier and safer to cut ties.
Hmm. Last question for you, Erin. I mean, you mentioned the TikTok ban. You have covered social media extensively.
Yes.
Now you're covering the way that AI companies are interacting with the government.
Yeah.
Do you see any similarities, differences, in terms of how this is all playing out? I mean, this is these are issues that have spanned multiple administrations,
Yeah.
right? And so I just wonder, how you're thinking about, is this a story that we've seen before? The supply chain risk is obviously something new, but
Yeah.
can we learn anything from past Silicon Valley brush ups with the government? I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is new in a lot of ways, and there's also like a lot of history that comes into it. So I mean, like if you look at tech companies working with the military, there's obviously like a rich history of that happening and also employees protesting it. So most famously you have Project Maven in 2018, like Google declined to renew its contract three after 3,000 or thousands of Google employees signed an open letter opposing it. So there's history of tech companies working with the military and companies' response to that. Obviously, in a lot of ways with AI, we're in very uncharted territory. And look, when you're asking that question, what I was thinking, I was talking to a lawyer yesterday about these two questions of lethal autonomous weapons and mass surveillance. And I was asking, like, oh, like, what can AI do with that? And what this person was really hammering home for me was that, like, Congress needs to act. Like, and in that way, we're in like a very similar situation to social media where we really don't have any meaningful regulation of social media on a national level, despite these services being around for years and years. So I think if anything, like one of the real parallels that we have is just tech companies being so far ahead of Congress in terms of regulation that we're now in this gray area where like, yeah, like private companies are trying to decide like what should be acceptable for this kind of technology.
Great. Well, Erin, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Erin Wu, our reporter here at The Information.